So without taking time further, we are going to start today's webinar, which is titled as Women's Participation in Social Justice and Nonviolent Movement in South Asia. So hello and namaste everyone. My name is Pawan Roy, and I'm acting as a president of Center for Social Change. Before I start welcoming our distinguished panel speakers, commentators, and today's webinar chair and participant, I would like to take a quick time to brief about Center for Social Change. There are a lot of participants who doesn't know about Center for Social Change, so I'll just quickly go through it. Center for Social Change is a social think tank organization which is established in the year 2015, right after the massive and devastating earthquake, actually. That's how we remember, like when we have started our organization. This 2015 year was a turning point for many of us. Many of us who were part of the organization now were also engaged and busy distributing relief materials together to the needy peoples at that time. This convergence of idea between many of us is working together now in Center for Social Change. Center for Social Change is currently focusing its work on the issues around non-violence, civil resistance, and peace building. Likewise, democracy and governance, migration and human mobility, civic space and civil society development are some of the areas of intervention. We often publish like policy briefs, research finding reports, infographics as a part of our social change movement. Our regular publications are easily available on our website as well as on our social media platform. And as you know that most of you also heard about this webinar from various social media platforms. Last year, during the same time, we have also conducted a similar webinar on how COVID, COVID and lockdown actually sidelined many of the non-violent movements all around the world. This webinar also gave us strong actually insight to further discuss issues that affect the whole social justice system during the time of crisis. Non-violent movements which are going all around the world and especially in the South Asian context will be highlighted in many of our webinar series which are yet to come. At the same time, I would also like to take the privilege to talk a little about why we are organizing this webinar when most of the South Asian countries are facing a second wave of novel coronavirus pandemic. We also know that the pandemic actually lifted various perimeters of our realities. It lifted ineffective government mechanisms, the weak health system, and the poor coordination between the organization inside and outside the nation. The main objective to conduct the webinar here is to analyze deeper how women play an important role in social justice and non-violent movement. Women-led movements, whether it is social or political, are more non-violent in nature. In this webinar, we will listen to our panel speakers to affirm that this statement or say this hypothesis. Now, I would stop talking and would like to introduce today's panel chair and my colleague, longtime colleague, Dr. Prakash Bhattarai. Prakash is a well-known name in the field of social justice movement and research. He has a strong background both in activism and academics. He has co-founded many prominent organizations in Nepal, of which Center for Social Change is one of them. He is also the founding president of Center for Social Change. So without delay, I hand over this platform to Dr. Bhattarai for further introduction of panel speakers and commentator. At last, I would like to thank all our panel speakers who agreed to be a part of this webinar on short notice. And I also would like to thank all participants who thought the webinar or this webinar will be fruitful to them. So Dr. Bhattarai, the floor is yours.
Okay. Thank you, Pawan, for a quick introduction of Center for Social Change and the objectives behind organizing this this important webinar. As Pawan already mentioned about Center for Social Change, and one thing that I'd like to emphasize here is we as a Center for Social Change trying to create a public space for individuals of all segments of society to share knowledge, experiences, and ideas on common interests of individuals and the communities. So this webinar titled Women Participation in Social Justice and Nonviolent Movement in South Asia is part of our ongoing series to generate as well as disseminate knowledge on contemporary social justice and nonviolent movement that have taken place in South Asian region. So in this series, we are planning to organize at least 5 such webinars over the next 1 year. So to understand the deeper dynamics of social justice and nonviolent movement in the region. So we would like to thank all our distinguished speakers, commentators, and participants for joining today's sessions. And we had overwhelming number of people who registered for this event. So we are very excited for your interest and enthusiasm. Uh, so, as Pawan has already, mentioned about, all these, objectives behind organizing this webinar, but we also have kind of crafted like 4 major questions that we would like to explore further in today's, 90 minutes long webinar series. So our first question is like how our distinguished speakers assess the women participation in various social justice and nonviolent movement in their own country as well as in South Asia. The second question that we'd like to explore today or discuss today is what are the key factors that often motivates women to take lead or just participate in social justice and nonviolent movement. And our third question is whether our speakers have any observation whether the social justice and nonviolent movement led and participated by women are more effective than the men dominated movements. And our final question for today's discussion is what are the key impeding factors that have discouraged women to participate in or lead social justice and nonviolent movement in South Asian countries. So so these will be kind of 4 major questions, but we are also interested to hear more from from our speakers today. So we have 4 distinguished speakers. I first would like to introduce Dr. Meena Poudel. Dr. Poudel is a sociologist who has obtained her Ph.D. from UK's Newcastle University and has 30 years history of development research and feminist work on issues affecting the lives of socially excluded and politically marginalized groups in Nepal and various parts of Asia, Western Europe, and North America, with various organizations, including Oxfam, USAID, and UN system, as well as academia. Before returning to migration policy work, Dr. Poudel was a senior visiting research fellow for the period of 2008 to 2013 at UK's Newcastle University and a teaching faculty member of gender and social inclusion at Purbanchal University, Nepal, from 2013 till 2018. In recent years, she's engaged more on exploring various aspects of lives of vulnerable population to and experience various forms of migration in Asia and North Africa. She has written widely and spoken on these issues that include a single authored book dealing with hidden issues, social rejection experience by trafficked women in Nepal. So our second panel speaker is Ms. Rehana Wagha. She has been associated with the women's rights movement since her college days while keeping in touch with women at the grassroots. She has been an active member of South Asia Feminist Alliance. She has also been an active member of Women's Action for Better Workplaces. Moreover, she worked with the National Commission on the Status of Women as a consultant, research and advocacy on women's economic empowerment, political participation, and violence against women. She has also been working with the Women's Regional Network, India, Pakistan, that covers India, Pakistan, and Afghanistan as country coordinator. Besides, she has been teaching at various universities in Islamabad as a visiting lecturer. Gender, peace, and security is the major area for focus in teaching and research as a PhD scholar. So we have our today's session. We have our commentator, Dr. Punam Yadav. Dr. Punam Yadav is a lecturer in humanitarian studies and co-director of the Center for Gender and Disaster at UCL Institute for Risks and Disaster Reduction. She holds a PhD in Peace and Conflict Studies from the University of Sydney. Dr. Yadav worked at London School of Economics for about 3 years as a senior research fellow before moving to the University College London. Dr. Yadav has over 10 years of experience in development sectors, working with various international organizations, NGOs, as well as UN agencies. Dr. Yadav has extensively published on Nepal, including her book entitled Social Transformation in Post-Conflict Nepal, A Gender Perspective. The Chinese edition of this book was published in March 2020. Her other recent work include Can Women Benefit from War?, where she examines the transformative effects of war on women, and her co-authored piece, Unrely Wives in the Household Towards Feminist Genealogies for Peace Research, where they include a concept called wifeicization. Dr. Yadav's research interests include gender, conflict and disaster, political quota and women's political participation, and women, peace and security. Last but not the least, we have our panel speakers, Ms. Shreen Abdul Saroor. She is a co-founder of Manor Women's Development Federation and Women's Action Network, a collective of 11 women's groups that have been working on advocacy on women's rights and documentation with a focus in North and East of Sri Lanka. Challenges faced by Shreen in her own experience of being forcibly evicted and displaced, along with all the members of her community from the North by Lite in 1990, laid the foundation for her activism. Her activism grew when she implemented the Shakti Gender Equality Program in 1998. In 2004, the John B. Kroc Institute for Peace and Justice elected Shreen as one of the women peacemakers, and later that year, she was awarded a 2-year Echoing Green Fellowship to build a model resettlement village, bringing together Tamil and Muslim displaced communities in her hometown Manor. In 2008, Shreen was awarded the Voice of Courage Award by International Rescue Committees, Women's and Refugee Commissions for international and regional work on highlighting the plight of the internally displaced women. In 2011, Shreen was awarded the 5th International Bremen Peace Award under the category of Public Engagement for Peace and Justice. Since the end of the war in May 2009, Shreen has been working with women who have faced sexual violence and families that are looking for their missing family members, especially on litigation and international lobby through women's collective, call Women's Network that she founded in 2010. So yeah, we have a very interesting speakers in today's webinar session, and without further delay, I'd like to request Dr. Meena Poudel to give her remarks within 15 minutes time limits on the 4 questions that we posed like in the very beginning. So Dr. Poudel, the floor is yours. You're muted. Can you unmute, please?
Sorry. Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you, Prakashji, Pawanji, and the entire team at Social Change, and also my fellow speaker, commentator. Hello, Punamji, because we are meeting again after almost a year, and we had very good discussion in one forum last year in UK. And just before lockdown started, and also colleagues and friends and colleagues from all over the South Asia, they're attending. And I see some of the colleagues attending from Vienna as well, my colleague from Afghanistan. So it's a very good discussion. It's very good timing. And also the question you have crafted are, I guess these are just guiding questions, so we can roam around. And the thing is that when we talk about social justice, it's a quite vague, and I don't know what do we mean by social justice for this discussion, but maybe we can start thinking and reflecting upon what social justice we are talking about, and what do we mean by social justice from our perspective, from sociological perspective, from feminist perspective, from human rights perspective, from peace perspective, and of course from justice perspective. So I will try to highlight some of the elements and some of the yeah, basically I will be reflecting upon on my own experience working on this issue, and also supporting some of the groups in various parts of the region. A small correction: when you introduced me, you mentioned that my recent work in North America, it was North Africa. I haven't worked in America, so I mean, the information I'm going to share today is basically focusing South Asia, Central Asia, and North Africa experience, what I have observed, what I learned, and also I mean, my critiques on some of the movements that is grounded in various parts of this part of the global South region. So yeah, the first question is, what do you mean by social justice here in this context, and particularly focusing on South Asia, because we are South Asian speaker here. Look at the Sri Lanka, look at Pakistan, look at India, look at Nepal now. I mean, where we are heading to, and where our movements are, and what are the objectives, what were the objectives 20 years before, what were the objectives 30 years before, what were the objectives during colonial time, and where we are now. And have we achieved our objectives set by our senior campaigner, our the previous generation who started liberation movement, linking with the colonialism, linking with the human rights campaign, linking with the campaign against feudal patriarchy, and later on the capitalist patriarchy in the postmodern era. So these are some of the question that I just want to throw. Maybe we can reflect upon and think for later. But today, you are asking us to focus on basically focus on these 4 questions. Is assessing women's justice movement. Is that I will try to focus more on social movement, less on political movement. But again, they are interlinked, they are interconnected. We cannot just separate for the sake of discussion. So, yeah, social reform movement actually in both in South Asia and also in the East Asia. I worked briefly in Philippines and Thailand as well. What I see there is that during the Philippines, basically the conflict affected area, Mindanao area, and also the Manila, and the Thailand, also northern Thailand, also Sri Lanka, LTT area. I was there in late 90s, and yeah. So in my own country, experienced long war, and worked in Afghanistan for 3.5 years, and now in Libya. So I will see the social reform movement are actually, to me, they are literally misguided, and in many places co-opted by political campaign, political objectives. So, and then also particularly focusing on social movement related to social justice, to women's social justice. As a social reform movement happened, led by political forces, led by environmentalists, led by feminists, led by human rights groups, or led by various labor movement, actually did not properly challenge the existing patriarchal structure of society that actually affected the gender justice, women's rights justice, feminist focus justice movement. That's how I see. Whether you talk about predominantly Hindu society like India, Nepal, or you talk about predominantly Islamic society like Afghanistan, Libya, or Pakistan, Iran, Bangladesh, or you think about relatively secular, relatively liberal society like Philippines and Thailand. So, and the Central Asian countries. basically in different degree that the various social movements are in actually isolated, are running in isolation. They have gender agenda, they have women's agenda, they have gender related other agenda, whether it's a reproductive right issue, whether it's the dowry system, whether this the traditional practices like witchcraft and early marriage in Afghanistan and various countries. So they are actually women at the grassroots level, and also women, professional women, and also the labor movement women, the workers women. And look at in Bangladesh, the workers, the women workers, they are so powerful. And but they are trying to organize, but co-opted either by NGOs, NGOization of movement, or picked up by donor and then projectized movement, and or picked up by political parties, patronized and imposed by patriarchal point of view, and then the whole movement is it kind of influenced by not from their original agenda, but by external imposed agenda. So I think that is what I see here in Nepal. Some of the example, I was directly, indirectly associated with the various movement in Nepal, like the migrant women's movement here, the equal wages movement, and also the social stigma against movement against social stigma, women who return from migration, and the traffic women organized movement, and also the local peace committee. A few years ago, I was evaluating the local peace committee, impact of peace committee in Nepal. What I found basically, again, they are dictated by locally influential political, cultural, social structures and their leaders. They were not allowed to run through with their agendas. They were not allowed to develop their own very focused strategy. So to me, it's kind of it's a lack of autonomy, lack of independence to organize, to run the social women's justice movement. I see. I'm not saying that the grassroots women, professional women, women's at various levels, excluding elite and politically dominant political elites. I'm just excluding them. Those are the forces actually influencing and hijacking movement. But women in various walk of lives, whether there's the traffic women, migrant returnee, labor women, farmers. Look at in Bangladesh, the women's farmers movement is so strong in the village. And also the gender-based violence campaign in India, gender-based violence campaign in Nepal, and acid campaign against acid attacks, and particularly the recent movement in India and Nepal, particularly focusing on rape cases. And in Nepal also very strong human rights defenders groups are there. And the local cooperatives, local forestry user group, local various cultural groups, they are actually in various form, various perspective, they are actually solely targeting their rights, and they are asking for justice, whether it's environmental justice, whether the gender-based violence justice, or women rights, whatever you name them. Basically, they want to be away from they want to be part of the change. Let's put that way. They want to be part of the change. They want to be part of the justice process. But their desire, their interest, their plans are, I'm not sure they are allowed to run through with their own ideas and the independent and their vision they generated originally. That is big question. To me, I see the projectization, NGOization, and politicization. Politicization is good, but it's a not politicization for the sake of agenda or strategy. It's a politicization for the vote. Politicization for the somebody, some section, some groups, very much narrow interest. So this is what is happening. So I see from distance is I feel sorry to these campaigners and the groups, they emerging from the bottom of the society, trying to respond the discrimination and the oppression and the violence they have been encountering, but they are not properly supported by other group. Instead of supporting, they are co-opted, hijacked. And but still, the motivating factor is there because they are the people, they are the women, they are the grassroots and the real change maker. They have kind of courage, which is very interesting and it's very inspiring for us as a researcher, as kind of, I mean, living in urban area and talking about all these things. So for us, it should be very, to me, it's very inspiring because I learned so much from them. I don't know what are the factors keeping them alive, and I don't know what are the factors keep them moving and not to get tired. So that is something that is strength is there in society. I guess one is solidarity and another is their commitment, which I don't know whether we have that commitment, that level, deeper level of commitment or not. I don't know. But these people, the women at the grassroots level and women at the women fighting for the cause, they have that commitment. And I'll give you an example. When the findings of the peace committee review I was doing, what they were saying to me is that basically when I was interviewing them, and also I found that the cultural perception are stronger than social policies. So that's what I'm saying. They are trying to change social perception on rights, wrongs, justice, injustice, violence, non-violence, everything. They're trying to change social perception. Also, they're trying to, by changing the social perception on various elements of social processes, that means they are also trying. They're trying to change society towards positive and towards more conducive to everyone, and to where the injustices are not there or less than what is happening now. And also the women are saying that social practices are influential than legal framework. So when you come to the urban area, when you talk to the dominant political forces and the political process, so we always talk about affirmative policies, this and that and this and that, and policy, basically the liberal feminist dominant ideology saying that, okay, if you change law, everything fix. That is not true, because what I found myself in research and also what I read from various post-colonial and various feminist literature, that is very clear that, and also look at our own society, that social practices are much more, whether it's the practices influenced by Hinduism or Islam or I don't know, you name it, in the name of religion, in the misinterpretation, misconception on these cultural practices are being used against social change, against social justice, against women or some excluded section of society. And also another point I wanted to highlight here, that the individual attitudes are much more rigid than the institutional plans. So again, going back to my comments on this liberal feminist and the liberal political process impose policy framework, affirmative policy, and all these things, we talk a lot about that. Unless you change the attitude, that we have classic example in our own country, let's not go far away. What are the policy we have in the name of gender? Every ministry, every unit, every section of this structure, the institution, there is a market institution, or there is the state institution, they have all these glossy policies about women's rights, social justice, women's justice, and non-violence, all these things. But what is happening today, it's just not working. So that is what I'm saying. Unless you change perception, unless you start from the bottom of the society, unless you get into the every and each layers of the social section, we won't be able to achieve the justice objective of justice movement. Also, there another comment I wanted to make here that again, based on learning from these various campaigns and cooperative movement, peace committee, and the various formal, informal network at the grassroots level, the cultural groups, social groups, economic groups, and also the political groups. That concept of gender mainstreaming and the justice found to be understood as kind of numerical integration, numerical inclusion of women's head. Okay, you count their head by percentage, 10, 20, 30, 50, whatever percentage we talk about, and include them in the policies, and then rather than I'm running out of time, I think, rather than counting their views.
Yeah, 2 minutes.
Okay, thank you. If you add 20 women, but you don't count one views from one woman or one perspective, one perspective from women's point of view, you don't do anything. So that's the thing. So to me, counting is more important than head counting, but we are running behind head counting. And in the name of inclusion, in the name of social justice, in the name of women's rights, in the name of gender mainstreaming, in the name of you name it, we are just counting heads, but not valuing the perspective coming from that level. So that is what is happening, and which is not actually shaking the power structure of social, cultural, and political processes. That is actually that construct injustice, construct violence, and construct discrimination against women. So now I will stop here, and maybe we can continue in our discussion time. So thank you for that time.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Poudel, for your very insightful presentation. And now, without further delay, I'd like to request Rehana Wagha to present your remarks within 15 minutes time limit. You need to unmute.
Yeah, thank you very much, Prakash, and all the other worthy panelists. It's a pleasure to be part of this discussion. Actually, my battery is running down, and I just realized that it is not charging. So if I may, it's around 13%. So I will try to finish it quickly and then fix the problem. But please bear with me this inconvenience if I, I do not finish it in time. So by talking about women's participation in the movement for social justice in Pakistan, I would say that overall women's struggle against patriarchy or dictatorship remained non-violent in Pakistan. There are few exceptions, for example, in the recent case of conflict in Swat region and the Muhajir Qawmi, women's participation in Muhajir Qawmi movement in Sindh province in 1980s, where women have been overtly and sometimes covertly supporting violent extremism or jihadist ideology. The origin and challenges of the women's rights movement in Pakistan lie within the Islamization of both state and society since the creation of Pakistan in 1947. In the beginning, women who participated in independence movement took to the task of women's empowerment through social welfare programs aimed at women's economic empowerment and creation of spaces for women's political participation. This was the time when all women forums like All Pakistan Women Association, which was called APPA, and PANWA were created. This can be called as the first phase or the first wave of women's rights movement.
Sorry for the interruption. Can you just, make this video a bit clear, because we can only see your head.
Okay. Let me.
Yeah.
Is it fine now?
Yeah, it's very.
Okay. Okay. Thank you so much. This can be called as the first phase or the first wave of women's rights movement, which was mostly apolitical in its nature. And these organizations operated within the given patriarchal structures imposed upon them by the state and society, without posing any little challenge to the state and society. Women's rights movement took an important turn when General Ziaul Haq started Islamization of the society after imposing martial law in the country in 1979. It started, 77. It started with the campaign of a small number of urban progressive women, women rights activists of the.
I think we lost her because of the battery.
Oh yeah, I think we need to get back to her later on. So if Shreen is ready, then I think we can begin with this, Shreen. And I'm really sorry for this technical.
Okay.
difficulties.
Rehana is a good friend of mine too, and I was thinking what went wrong with her computer. But thank you very much for inviting me for this forum. And kind of, it's a very difficult time for me to talk about social movement in Sri Lanka, but also I'm trying to find some silver line, because we are all have not only dictators and civil society space shrinking and have so much of problems surviving doing our work, but also COVID has also shrunk our civil society space and grassroots movements, activism very drastically. So in that context, I don't want to completely take away everybody's enthusiasm about social movement. So I will start with two examples of women's social justice struggle in Sri Lanka. Both minority communities, both community I belong to. I'm a Tamil speaking woman. I'm a Muslim woman too. So I belong to the Muslim. So as you all know, Sri Lankan war, a brutal war, ended in 2009. Is it clear? Is it clear? Okay. It's raining heavily, so that's why I'm a little worried. So the brutal war ended in 2009 with the military defeating the Tamil Tigers. So it's a 30 years of civil war in Sri Lanka, and about 75,000 to 150,000 people, I mean, nobody has the right accurate number, got killed, many disappeared. So today, if you see any form of struggle, any form of resilient struggle in Sri Lanka is in the form of these people who survived the war. One of the struggle that I admire a lot is the families of disappeared. Sri Lanka is number 2 in the world with regard to disappearance. Sri Lankan government, consecutive government have made descent disappear, and also people from the minority community disappear. So in the aftermath of the civil war, there has been this movement of mothers coming together, looking for, particularly the family members, they surrendered to Sri Lankan military for rehabilitation. Because at the end of the war, government announced that they will rehabilitate these people and send back. So many of the women went and surrendered their children, mostly, because children were recruited by Tamil Tigers at the end of the war. So many of them never came back. So very interestingly, this movement is the only movement that has given oxygen to many of us. Our work in the last, like 12 years or so, ever since the war ended. And these women are very, very resilient. At the initial stage, when I saw them, they were in tears. But then last time I saw them was in Geneva. And they were demanding justice from the UN to any international bodies. And they wanted to be heard as in their own voice. And these women are very, I mean, every district that we have a district coordinator, it has a leadership. These women are very resilient, and because of them, the UN, which tried to palm down the responsibility of accountability, particularly to investigate on war crime and crime against humanity of the then Rajapaksa government that committed that crime, which is elected now. They have been tying, UN also gave time to Sri Lankan government, many governments, right? None of the government had the political will. Now, last March, because of this women's resilient struggle, and these women's voice, even with the pandemic, they were coming on Zoom calls and recording their, voices and sending it to High Commissioner's office and all. It's a unique mechanism that the High Commissioner has come up with. We have a resolution against Sri Lankan government, the current state, which talks about international jurisdiction, that the Sri Lankan governments plurally, consecutively has failed to give the truth and justice to these women. Therefore, High Commissioner's office has taken on the mandate of collating, preserving and analyzing the data of all these missing people and to do an international investigation using international jurisdiction. This is purely because those women struggle, right? But like Meena, madam talked about how politicized these things are. Very interestingly, in Sri Lanka also, some of these women, when we started, we were all eating in one plate and we started doing this collectively, but the politicians, the men, particularly the nationalism and the diaspora men have really chipped these women's groups. They are chipped, but they are working in whatever forum. Very interestingly, it also has a hierarchy. Say, for example, the families of disappeared of the military atrocities are very visible, but the families of disappeared of the LTT cannot come into that movement, right? There is differences. And also like the single women whose husbands or family members have been abducted by Rajapakshas because of their, activism, journalism and all, those people are not connected. They are deliberately cut. So it's nationalism. So politics, nationalism, who you are, who committed atrocities. So the social movement is broken in that way also. But there is a resilient story behind those women's hard work. And one interesting thing that happened last February is there was a march from the east to north, P2P march. It was about a memorial, a war memorial has been destroyed by the Sri Lankan state. So there was a march. So many of the mothers got court orders. Some of them have even got 12, 15 court orders. So the court order is only for their district. Say, for example, if a woman is from the eastern province, court order is for that district. What she did was she traveled to the other district and protested. And then the other woman traveled to the other district and protested. So they figure it out how to do this resilient work, given the fact the state is so aggressive on you, right? So that's something that we have to recognize, that how, because this is part and parcel of their life. They can't shut down and go, unlike civil society or donor agency or anybody. When the funding is over, they can't go to another topic or anything like that. It is part and parcel of their life. Until they find the truth, they will be struggling. We have lost about 72 mothers. By, many of those mothers are on the street side. They are protesting. They are fasting. They do a rotating fasting, and also we have lost about 72 mothers in the last 12 years or so because of their struggle. Now, I'll go to another topic also. The Muslim women in Sri Lanka after the end of the war. The Muslims have become a target because the singular majority government always wants some form of terrorism. So they blame LTT as terrorist movement, and then they wanted to bring in Muslim Islamic terrorism. So they have been attacking Muslim community constantly. So in that context, more recently, when the pandemic happened, Sri Lanka brought in a forcible cremation policy of every COVID dead bodies. So the Muslim community, which is 10%, it was shocking to them because, it's punishment when you are throwing a janasa into a fire. So over 200 Muslims have been cremated forcefully, whereas WHO to every country in the whole world, including the India that is also anti-Muslim, has given the option of Muslims burying their COVID kith and kin. So it was the women, those women who were struggling for justice, jointly with the Muslim women, started a campaign. So two women went and tied a white handkerchief onto a crematorium where a 20-day-old Muslim baby was forcefully cremated by the state. Then the Muslim women took it to another level. They said it's haban. Haban is the white cloth that the Muslim community wrap the dead bodies. So we call it a hafan protest. So we all started tying hafan in our hand, our vehicles, our door, everywhere, protesting that the Sri Lankan government should revert this policy. At the same time, the Human Rights Council session was also happening, and the Sri Lankan government was taken on. So much so, the Muslim women and the Tamil women joined hand with each other and force Sri Lankan government to reverse this policy. Today, we have temporary burial approved for Muslim community, but the burial ground is only in one area. It's getting full. So very interestingly, the campaign is going on, but they have allowed us to bury the Muslim community dead bodies in certain area. Therefore, the Catholics are also burying there. So it's a collective struggle of this women's social movement that gave us the oxygen, the Muslim women, to join hand and demand accountability and justice in the larger international arena, the forum that has been created for them. So that's one side of the story. The other thing is that many of these women are also very interestingly, because the now Sri Lankan government, the current government is the comprises of the military that committed war crime and the Rajapakshas. The evidence collection, gathering and all. Government is very scared of women because they know that the evidence that we gather, wherever we are in a protest, wherever we are in the front line, they know that we are not put because of a political agenda or some money or some NGO agenda or some donor agenda. So they find it very difficult. So like, systematically, Sri Lankan government is now going behind these victim community activists who are part of the social justice movement, asking for access to justice in Sri Lanka. I will leave it with that, and then I can answer. I will answer any question afterwards. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Shreen, for a very interesting presentation and bringing this Sri Lankan interesting case into the discussion. I think Rehana is now back, and I'd like to request Rehana to continue your presentation.
Thank you very much, Prakash. And I am really sorry for the inconvenience. It happens when your kids are using your laptop and suddenly you know that the battery is not charging. So again, I will start with because it was, I just began and the battery went out. So while talking about women's participation in social justice movements in Pakistan, I would say that overall women's struggle against patriarchy or dictatorships remain non-violent. There are a few exceptions, for example, in the recent case of Swat conflict, as I mentioned, and also Muhajir Qawmi movement in Sindh province in the 1980s, which were violent, militant organizations, and where women were found to be covertly and sometimes overtly supporting violent extremism or jihadist ideology. The origin and challenges of the women's rights movement in Pakistan lie within the Islamization of both state and society since the creation of Pakistan in 1947. In the beginning, women who participated in the independence movement took to the task of women's empowerment through social welfare programs aimed at women's economic empowerment and creation of spaces for women's political participation. This was the time when all women forums like All Pakistan Women's Association, APWA and PANWA, they were created. This can be called as the first phase or the first wave of women's rights movement, which was mostly apolitical in its nature, and these organizations operated within the given patriarchal structures imposed upon them by the state and society, without posing any little challenge to the state and society. Women's rights movement took an important turn when General Ziaul Haq started Islamization of the society after imposing martial law in the country in 1977. It started with the campaign of a small number of urban progressive women rights activists of the Women's Action Forum, WAF, against the agenda of Islamization adopted by the military dictatorship of General Ziaul Haq in the 1980s. That was aimed at framing the Sharia laws to control women bodies, promote rigid gender segregation in the public space, and strengthen patriarchal social institutions. The challenge of Islamization has remained since then undeterred and transformed itself into the threat of Talibanization in certain parts of the northwestern frontier region of Pakistan post 9/11. Unfortunately, women's movement in Pakistan in its early phase did not take the shape and momentum that could have led to greater social transformation and gender equality. This transformation was hampered by the successive military regimes imposing Deobandi, a fundamentalist version of Islam, by making scriptural interpretations of Sharia to provide legitimacy to their undemocratic actions and plans. It was that time when the military dictator Ziaul Haq tried to forcibly mold the society to a perceived way of life attributed to imaginary sociology of Muslims of the past. Separation between the sexes and marginalization of women as features of many older societies becoming impractical with every coming day, of course. The WAF-led movement acquired attention in general and sympathy among the urban middle class. However, with the return of democracy as well as the emergence of certain donor-supported civil society organizations in the next decade, the progressive movement has not only lost its radical character, but it was increasingly subsumed into the institutional web of non-governmental organizations. NGOs like Shirkatgah, Aurat Foundation, Rosen, Bidari, they all emerged during this period. Women at the forefront during 1980s who were from a privileged class, having good education and urban exposure, they started to participate in the activities of WAF. It started with the affordable agenda of peaceful resistance, mostly acceptable to the men of the relevant group of activists. Many of those renowned feminists seen as champions in the struggle of democracy, secularism, and social justice in that period established their NGOs, which in turn fostered the depoliticization of women's rights movement. So women's struggle for social justice in Pakistan, it has gone through different stages and various trajectories since 1980s. With the risk of oversimplification, it would not be incorrect to trace the roots of the secular women's rights movement back to the early 1980s. This group of progressive urban middle class women started to voice their concerns against the negative implications of the drive of Islamization under the military regime of General Ziaul Haq. The establishment of Women Action Forum was basically aimed to organize various political protests, actions against anti-women laws, promoting gender segregation by curtailing the mobility of women and their participation in social sphere. People question whether the robust activism of women through the 1980s, acknowledged locally and internationally as a women's movement, can be called a movement, given the limited number of activists and groups in the struggle that participated for many years and remained mostly state-oriented. The answer of this question, of course, depends upon one's understanding of social movements. Social movements, by definition, must be dynamic and therefore changing. Otherwise, they stop being a social movement. So the co-option and NGOization of women's movement can be seen as a survival strategy in an environment where the military mullah alliance left very little space for the secular progressive forces to operate. One of the aggressively promoted stance by opponents of secular women's rights activists was and is that feminism is a North American European agenda, if not an outright conspiracy, and its local westernized proponents at best are out of touch with the ground reality of the local women and unrepresentative of their needs, adverse agents of Western imperialist agendas. Aided by such propaganda, feminists are popularly projected as aggressive anti-men women. The net result is obviously a discomfort with and lack of ownership of the feminist label, even among women actively demanding greater rights and opportunities for women. Thus, we also see the parallel emergence of faith-based women organizations which endeavor to locate women rights in Islamic discourse. In this regard, feminist scholar Afia Sherbano Zia, feminist Pakistani scholar, observed that during the 1980s, several women's research and activist groups embraced the idea of strategic worth of using religion or religious framework as a tool for negotiating and advancing women's rights. A grave implication of this compromise was the creation of space for right-wing ideologies and politics within women's rights movement in Pakistan and other Muslim countries. However, the success of third phase of women's rights activism, which was mostly led by NGOs, can be witnessed through the increased political participation of women sitting in Parliament House today and the promulgation of pro-women laws in the past 1 decade or so. Important legislation was done by the relatively progressive government of Pakistan People's Party, which was mainly the outcome of hard work of women parliamentarians belonging to People's Party and in collaboration with the progressive women's rights activists from NGOs. However, besides all the progress made so far, the implementation of these laws remains an issue owing to the persistence of patriarchal culture, cultural norms, and lack of institutional support. Relatively few women in Pakistan, even sitting in power positions, self-identify as feminists. Most of them were urban educated women with access to English knowledge and literature. A substantial number of them had pre-existing links with their transnational women's movements or and with leftist ideology, if not any groups. Those who identified as feminists, identified themselves as feminists since the 1980s have been inclined to differentiate between a women's movement, even a women's rights movement, from a feminist one. The women's movement would include all those seeking to bring about gender equal rights and greater autonomy for women within the operative structures of state and society. So therefore, women in the right-wing political parties like Jamaat-e-Islami or Jamaat-ud-Dawa or Al-Huda also claim to be women's rights activists, striving to promote and protect women's rights provided by Islam, and by sometimes subverting the Islamic rhetoric on women's rights in their own favor. However, this general division within the women's rights movement seems to be arbitrary because it does not comprehensively cover the diversity of the women's rights struggle taking place in various contexts in Pakistan. For example, there are women struggles again under the auspice of nationalist political parties, which have not been properly documented. The examples include Sindhyani Tehreek during 1980s, the campaign of Baloch women against illegal disappearances of Baloch activists, nationalist political workers, or women in Pashtun Tahaffuz movement. Other examples of women's struggles include the ones which mainly revolve around the livelihood rights, like that of women in Anjuman Mazar in Pakistan, women in Fisher Folk Forum, or Sindhu Bachao Tarla. The progress and success of women's rights movement in Pakistan is dependent upon the recognition of the diversity of the struggles of women and the formation of cross-sectional alliances around the broader issues, which is seen as happening in the fourth phase of women's rights movement in Pakistan. For that matter, it becomes necessary to comment on the Aurat March or Aurat Azadi March being held in major cities of Pakistan on every 8th March since the year 2018. The presence of a great number of women from diverse backgrounds and the slogans raised by them is an evidence of the fact that the fourth phase of women's rights movement is much vibrant and more impactful. Participants of Aurat Azadi March seem to be more clear about their demands and agenda. They are not only demanding full independence and bodily autonomy in the public sphere, but also challenging the foundations of private sphere. These millennial women exposed to the social media are introduced or have introduced a new critical juncture for feminist struggles, connecting it to the transnational women's movement by raising the slogan of my body, my right. And they are also challenging the very foundations of patriarchy by symbolic dissolution of the false gendered public and private dichotomy by holding the placards like "Lo baith gayi sahi se." The stronger the demands like "My body, my right," "Mera jism, meri marzi," of the Aurat Azadi March, the stronger the backlash from the society as it was expected. The diversity of debate and diversity of demands and the backlash against them, as well as the divisions and debates within the organizers and participants of Aurat March are being termed as a part of the process, which will hopefully culminate into the rise of a wider and stronger women's rights movement in Pakistan in the near future. The prospects for the success of women's rights movement are tied to the participation of women's activists in broader democratic struggle and the building of alliances with pluralist political forces in the country. Moreover, the women's rights movement will have to take into account the issues of social class, ecology, which has been so far largely ignored by the urban women activists in the past, causing a disconnect and sometimes ruptures in the struggle for women's equality and justice. So thank you very much. And I stop over here and welcome any questions.
Thank you, Rehana, for a very insightful presentation. And now we have a very limited time. I don't know how we could not be able to manage well. I want to go to our commentator, Dr. Punam Yadav, to comment on these three presentations that we just heard, and maybe if you have any critical questions to be asked to the panelists, then you can also do that. So you also have like 15 minutes to finish your comment.
Thank you very much. And this is really a big job listening to such wonderful presentations. And so much insights that I got from all of your presentations. So I'll just go by the same kind of order. So I'll just start by commenting or just making some brief comments on Meena and then Rehana and then Shreen. So all of these presentations, as I said earlier, it was brilliant, lots to take on, lots of insights. So Meena ji actually started with what do we mean by social justice? Who defines it? Whose perspective do we consider when we talk about social justice? That is very important. And who is defining it? What is the standard? And I totally agree with that. So we need to think about as well, who is defining social justice for us? Is it defined by the people who are impacted by it? Is it defined by the elite of the country, or is it defined by the grassroots women? And Meena, you also talked about what have we achieved so far, or have we achieved so far? And then she talked about how our social movements are misguided or co-opted by political parties, feminist organizations, NGOs, and NGOization actually came in all of the three presentations. Silo was another thing that Minaji mentioned, because there are lots of social movements going on in various forms, for instance, in the form of forestry groups, Ama Samua Mothers Group, and in the form of local peace committees and women in various political parties, as well as women's rights defenders and so on. But they're all working in silos, and despite several efforts of coordination, there are certain times when they come together, but then again the movements get fragmented. And we observed that during the citizenship rights movement in recent years in Nepal. So initially, women were very all coming together to talk about rights of women regarding citizenship, but then that got fragmented, and that was very much politicized. And then the debate actually ended up being the right of daughters or the daughter-in-law. So that moment we saw how it fragmented and weakened. That doesn't mean that the women's movement has been weak and they have not been able to do anything, or they have received a pushback. Women are still pushing it back and trying to make a difference. But then again, that strong movement was fragmented due to the politicization of the issue. So co-option is a big problem, and as we heard in all of these three presentations, and civil society movements are actually very much led by the donors' agenda often, because all of these three countries that we are talking about, governments are not funding any of the women's rights movement. And in order to really carry on with our agendas, we need funding. And where the funding comes from, these fundings come from various donor organizations who already have their own agenda and they would like to push forward, and there are terms and conditions that we need to follow, and that has time limit attached to it. So if you're talking about social movement, if you're talking about women's movement, it should be a long-term process. It takes a lot of time, but then if you have a time frame attached to it, certain budget attached to it, and in addition to that, certain outcomes that we need to produce, or outputs that we need to present, then that becomes very difficult. So this is one of the challenges I think all of the feminist movements or women's rights movements are facing around the world, in particular in the countries that we are talking about today. And again, I mean, so my question to Meena ji really is that on the one hand, we are talking about personal is political as feminist. Every personal issue is political, and therefore we need to politicize in order to raise our voice, concern, and then bring in policies. But in your presentation, you said politicization is a main problem in Nepal. I would love to hear a little bit more on this. Why do you think politicization as a problem, or at least a hurdle for the feminist or women's rights movement in Nepal? I also like your point about how these kind of movements are very much top down, not bottom up, where the problems are all at the bottom up. So there is this othering, like we are elite people, we are women who know everything. We know about women's rights and we know what you need. And so it's very much top down, NGO-led kind of interventions. So the bottom up approach you emphasized on the importance of the bottom up approach. One thing that I'd like to comment on that as well, because every time we talk about women's representation or their contribution to policy making or any kind of social change, on the one hand, we recognize them as agents of change, but at the same time, we are so quick to make a decision that this is a descriptive representation. We are counting heads, but actually they are not being listened to, even though they are making so much difference in real life. So they might not be able to speak in certain forum, if it is, especially the forum is male dominated, let's say in a political institution, but in their community, they might be making a lot of difference. And I have written a lot about it. So why do we give agency to women at one point and then take it away immediately, saying that you are just a head count, you have not been able to make any difference because these men are not giving you a chance to do anything? I mean, that is actually right in some sense, but at the same time, we are not recognizing what contributions these women are making. If we do not recognize the contributions they are already making, we won't be able to then support them fully. So that's kind of another comment. If Minaji would like to add something to that. Coming back to Rehana, I was really enlightened by your presentation. It was brilliant. You really laid down the feminist movements from early on to first phase of feminist movement, how it was very much led by the patriarchal institution, operated by the patriarchal institutions, and very much political, then to the religious, and then post 9/11, and then how it was against the religious fundamentalism. And I also really like the way you presented how the initial feminist movements were very much class-based. So certain people coming from certain class were actually engaging and participating in these kind of movements, whereas the middle class or lower class people were not able to participate, or did not have access to, or did not pay attention to. And so I really would like to know a little bit more about why certain class had access to. You did mention that they had the knowledge, they had the money, they had access to these NGO funding, or they were able to run these ones. So they knew the language of rights, and therefore they were able to engage in. So what was the problem for middle class or lower class people? Was it religious, was it institutional, or was it just because they did not have the knowledge and the exposure and access to this kind of funding? I mean, as in any nationalist movement, especially when it is against NGOs, we have seen being said in India, elsewhere, in almost every country, of course, in Sri Lanka too, that this is a Western concept, and we shouldn't be supporting it. It is against our faith, our culture, and so forth. Despite all of these challenges that you presented, and then you've now talked about the Azadi March, and now more and more women joining, and that is, and how women are transcending that class, as well as all kinds of barriers that they had faced. So, and you also talked about millennial having access to all of these social media, and having access to all of these knowledge, how they are pushing back, and they are participating in these kind of movements. So I would like to know a little bit more, if you can give some more examples as to what is encouraging these new generations to join this movement. What is encouraging women from other class who do not belong to that certain class taking part in this movement? What are the enabling factors that have become available to these women? So now moving on to the third one, Shreen, I really liked your presentation, and I often compare Sri Lanka with Nepal, because my work is very much in Nepal, and I see Sri Lanka as win-lose kind of context when we talk about war and post-war, whereas Nepal is, to some extent, can't say, but to some extent it's like win-win, because they came in, the peace agreement was signed, and it was in agreement, so there was like some level of win-win, and therefore those who were waging the war, involved in the war, protesting like Maoists, did not have to suffer what LTTE had to suffer. But Sri Lanka was win-lose. The government completely suppressed the LTT movement, and that had a lot of consequences. You could not talk about what you did during the war. Suddenly, those who were involved in war started getting disappeared. So that had a lot of consequences, and so you nicely laid out the consequences through the eyes of the struggles of these mothers of the disappeared people. My question to you, and I would really love to hear a little bit more about, is that you mentioned a couple of times, and many times actually, about the resilience of these women and the mothers. What is it that making them resilient? You did mention that they are resilient also because they are not getting any kind of NGO support, they are not taking money, and they are not involved in any political party. So they are seen as a very ethical. So the issue of ethics, and they are also not threatening the nationalism by getting money from NGOs or Western institutions, and also not being part of any kind of political parties, which means they are not anti-nationalist. But somehow what I'm trying to say is that they're not threatening the political party. So it is okay for them to protest in some form, even though there are lots of barriers and problems created for them. And so I wonder, what makes them resilient, despite the fact that 72 mothers have lost their life in this protest, and they're in the struggle for justice, in their struggle for justice. I mean, if there is a time, I would also love to know, not being involved or associated with any political party, and not receiving any funding from the donor organizations. Does it have anything to do with the narratives of nationalism in Sri Lanka? Because they're not threatening this narrative that has been created by Sri Lankan government, and therefore they're being accepted. So these are some of my thoughts, and I'll just leave it there. And I would really love to hear some of your comments. I know we have limited time, and I would love to have conversation even after this event. So yeah, thank you.
Thank you so much, Punamji, for your wonderful comments on the presentations. And actually, the questions are pretty clear to all three, speakers. So I just don't want to repeat. So maybe I just want to, give a floor to each panelist to respond to the questions. So first we can start from Meena.
Okay, thank you, Prakash. Thank you, Punamji, for your question. And I see some of the question in the text also. Maybe Pawanji has been following on that. Politicization, yes, I agree with you that politicization is important. But my question was that what do you mean by politicization? Particization is politicization, or making agenda public and bringing agenda into public discourse and influencing policy and practices is politicization? My position is the later one. That is, politicization is important, but here I'm talking about hijacking agendas and making agenda for the selling agenda to buy the vote. That politicization, particization is I'm against with. This is what I'm trying to say, because the quick fix and technocratic approach, basically neglecting the grassroots social movement, the women's organization, even the political parties, sister organization are becoming weaker now. When they were underground, they were much more stronger, they were powerful, they were influencing, and they were more organized, and linking with the social and cultural movement, with their political movement. But now when they are overground, they started playing with this liberal political process, and they are now weak, because this is basically the language of social justice is co-opted by the party politics for the sake of vote. That is what I'm trying to criticize, and I'm against with this. Don't don't buy or don't sell the grassroots movement for the sake of your vote. That is what I'm trying to say. But yeah, from the feminist perspective, from the women's rights perspective, justice perspective, yes, we do need to politicize. but not for the sake of one party or even the few members or section of the party. That is what I'm trying to say. Contribution to policy. Yeah, again, the whole issue about narratives of social justice may have to be reflected to capture the local reality. Because again, what we are observing here is that the normative framing of social justice is problematic, because that only gives us very limited scope and only limits us to count the head, not the views, not the perspective, not the ideology. So that is what the movements are becoming weak and co-opted by NGOs, co-opted by donor, and misinterpreted by state institution, not the movement group, not the initiator, not the social justice group. When the agendas are co-opted by the state and interpreted and imposed and explain whatever they do, they just hijack agenda, and then that is problematic, because that is what I'm trying to. That will not influence policy, inform policy the way it should be. And then what we get at the end of the day, the grassroots movement get diluted and get undermined and get neglected and separated from the original organic movement. So that is what I see, that I find very difficult to accept that. And also the whole issue around this top-down, and also, as I say, that economic empowerment and social justice have to be interconnected, because these are functioning in isolation, and they should be interconnected, and also this should be also connected, reflected with the socio-cultural dynamics of society, because the role of the social institution, the family, community, market, and the state institution, and their patriarchal, feudal, capitalist, whatever ideology they are holding, the forces blocking the pathways of justice and power of women, because they use women's power, women's movement, women's groups, and their strength for the sake of their personal benefit, whether it's a political benefit, economic benefit, cultural benefit, or social status strengthening benefit, but blocking women's pathway to advance their movement and achieve their goal. That's where I see the problem. That is what I'm saying, that it has to be interconnected. And the language, as you mentioned rightly, language of justice, social, who speaks? Now the political leader, the masculine perspective, and the feudal leader, they speak very loudly than women's movement. That is where I see the problem, and I find very difficult to accept that. Where is our mainstream women's movement now? What are they doing? What are their agenda? The agenda in Nepal context, agenda set by Sahana Pradhan and Mangala Devi in 1950s. Still those agendas are here. Yes, the grassroots movement, grassroots women, they started their own thematic agendas: gender-based violence, economic right, cultural right, forestry, various, but what is connection there? Yes, connection will be there for on the day of voting. So there I see the problem. That is why I'm saying that we need to move on with the technocratic approach to the social justice approach. That is what I'm saying, that we have to define what is social justice for us. Thank you.
Thank you, Minati. Rehana, like your question, can you respond to the question? Why women is, what is encouraging women to join this march? You're muted. Can you unmute, please?
Two of the questions, I think, which I captured from this, from Punam ji. Punam, thank you very much. I came across some of your research during my own research writing, and found it very enlightening. So it's very nice to be in touch with you on this forum. Why there was a disconnect between the women's movement led by the elite women, or the urban middle class, or and between the rural women's movement. I think this was again because at the grassroots, religious radicalization was it was very studied during the times of General Ziaul Haq during 1980s. And mostly this religious radicalization was done in the rural parts of Pakistan, in the towns, where women were recruited by Jamaat Islami, and we have seen women, campaigning for Jamaat Islami and supporting the referendum of General Ziaul Haq. Plus we have not seen any, concerted effort by the women from Women Action Forum or other smaller groups in the cities to connect with the women at the grassroots. But why they are now from lower middle class or some, from the rural background, women are connecting with the Aurat March or the fourth phase of women's rights movement. It is that I cannot, I agree with Meena ji that NGOization of women's movement has, adversely affected women's rights movement throughout the region, including Pakistan. But the women I see at the ground right now, who are at the forefront of the Aurat March as organizers and as participants, majority of them belong to, they are women working in NGOs. They have been working in NGOs. Women's Aurat Azadi March actually is distancing itself from the NGOs, or again, their stance is that because they are hijacking the agenda or influencing its agenda, donor-led, donor-driven funding activities should be avoided. But I must say that these NGOs played a great role in raising awareness regarding women's rights. And I do not see, harm in aligning of women's movement with political parties, because political parties in Pakistani context have played a great role in the restoration of democracy and in furthering the agenda of women's rights. So I think the alliances are needed to be built with the political parties, with NGOs also, because I don't see much harm in if funding is coming for the fundamentalist organizations to promote fundamentalist agenda, then why so much hue and cry over something which is coming to promote or further women's rights agenda? This is a complex, question for me, and I am still pondering upon it. There was a question I was seeing in the comments that women, in the case of Swat, any examples of women actively participating in Swat conflict? Actually, if you look at any intrastate conflict or civil war from a bottom-up approach, you will see women playing their part as collaborators, sometimes for recruitment, sometimes through giving donations at the minimum. So one cannot ignore women's agency in any conflict or civil war situation, and denial of women's agency in conflict is actually part of the problem. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Rehana ji. And now, Shreen, can you respond to the question?
I think something that I said was not clear, but this particular group of women I talked about, families of disappeared, they are very political. Don't forget, their sons and their husbands and their family members fought for Tamil Eelam, and then many of them died. So these women come with that political agenda of a separate territory within Sri Lanka. So these women lost their family members and surrendered some of their family members, and the Sri Lankan military never returned. They are also standing to say or give the counter narrative to what government, Sri Lankan majoritarian, single and nationalist government is saying to the international community. It is a humanitarian war. Nobody died, nobody disappeared. So these women are standing, you know, to this particular brutal military units, and also the military, that unit was led by Gotabaya Rajapaksa, who is the current president of this country. He is the #1 war criminal. So these women are standing against these personnel and asking for accountability in country and outside the country. Right? So that need to be understood, that they are politically very active, nationalistically very active. Their Tamil nationalism is very, very active and very broad. And they are the mothers of the LTTE cadres. So they will continue to fight the fight in non-violent way, not armed to the teeth the way the Tigers fought, but they will fight for their rightful existence in this country, where Rajapaksa regime is saying, you all are minorities in this country. We will just give you what we think is right, and you just have to cow down and eat that crumbs and just wait. That these women are, that is why they are so resilient. It's not only disappearance, but also the nationalism that they have taken on to. So they are very politically active women. Some of these women are now sitting in the municipal and town council, because more recently in 2016, when the regime change happened, one of the things that we women demanded is 25% quota for women. So many of the ground at the local authority level. So many of this local authority level, these women are there. These mothers, these sisters who surrendered their brothers and wives who surrendered their husbands are in political sphere. They are also in courtroom. There are over 50 odd habeas corpus cases taken up by women. I used to wonder why men are not coming forward to take up habeas corpus or writ application. These are women who are coming to court. Some of the court cases have been going on for the last 1 decade. Cases have been called 30, 40 times. One of the women who initiated the first habeas corpus case of disappearance of her husband, whom she surrendered, who happened to be LTT #2 or 3rd level of commander, got elected landslidely to become the provincial council member, Anandi Sasitharan, right? She has a women's political party now, right? These women are very, very vibrant, very, very active, these women are, right? So their search for missing members is not only for their own finding the truth, their own access to justice, or their own way of dealing with what happened to their family members, but also a political agenda. That's very important. And also, like, what is very important nowadays is that particular political agenda of these women, because I clearly remember in Geneva, one of the Tamil National Lands MP told me, these women are the living example of war crime and genocide committed against Tamils, right? They are living examples, right? That also comes, the resilient nature of those women comes with that also, that they are a political entity that is living and telling the Sri Lankan majoritarian government that is denying any war crime, that this has been committed against us for a reasonable demand of having territory, power devolution, and our own identity and our own area, right? So these women are very political. Now, when you have a conversation with them, it's very complicated. That they are not just plain wives of disappeared or mothers of disappeared. It's very complex when you have conversation. That's why I told you that there's hierarchy. Who is the most victim of the disappearance? They won't agree a woman who would openly say, Tamil Tigers abducted my child. No, they will not say. Many of those women's children have been abducted by LTT as well. So they are cause-wise, they are very active. They are very vibrant, right? Even during the previous regime, then there was a pause and there was a transitional justice period of time. Lots of NGOs funders poured in money of establishing Office of Missing Person. The women refused to engage. They said, no, we will never get any justice through majoritarian government. Singular government will not give us anything. We want accountability outside Sri Lanka. A genocide has been committed and accountability is very important. We don't trust Sri Lankan majoritarian government. So that political notion is very important because Sri Lankan Tamil politics is around that. There are so many political parties that got birthed because of these women's struggle. None of them are in parliament, but the men have used that opportunity and got into parliament. Thank you.
Thank you, Shreen. Actually, we're really running out of time, but I just want to, there are several questions, and I think some of them have already been responded by the panel speakers. But like one question, I think that's kind of common, and also kind of it, gives a kind of idea, like a way forward, kind of, question. So maybe like each speaker can speak like 1 or 2 minutes, like how can like we create a women's social movement that encompasses all ethnic, religious, caste differences without suppressing the voice of the women who are a minority and are marginalized. So
Shall
yeah.
I start?
Yeah.
Yeah. To me, I'll go back to my point that narrative of social justice may have to be reflected with the local reality, and organization like yours and discussion like this need to be continued, and we start questioning ourselves, what is our assumption on social justice, what is our expectation, what is our perception, what is our definition, and start kind of self-reflected discourse. I think that is what I want to see, and I'm happy to be part of that.
Thank you, Shreen.
So we have done such a thing in Sri Lanka. It's called Women's Action Network. It comprises of various communities. Particularly, we formed this in the post-war context to rebuild the women's movement in the north and the east, particularly. So it's donors were very shocked because we were collecting money to build organization, whereas donors tried to create tension among women's organization. If you write a beautiful project and come up with measurable and all those things, then so we said no measurable, nothing. We will do what we want to do, and we will go and create the women's groups that have been just completely went disarray because many of the leaders were killed, bombarded because of there was aerial bombing and all. So recreating women's groups in the north. That's how the mothers movement also came up. We have a land rights movement. We have families, political prisoners movement, where the PTA, Prevention of Terrorism Act, has taken a lot of people away from the families. And then we also have, cluster basis, like the garment factory workers, the factory workers, and the plantation workers movement and all. So like all these things connect us because of the patriarchy, because of the overall suppression of the women. Even in the constitution, Sri Lankan women are downplayed. Muslim women are, Article 16 of the constitution gives into various patriarchal laws. So what we are trying to do is to come together collectively to break that. That's one is to equally give women access to various forms of creating legislature. The other thing that we are trying to do is the quota, so that the 25% quota, the local authority went to the very affected women in the north and the east. Women are shaping the discourse. They are talking about various things, and currently Sri Lanka, we are questioning a terror state. What it means, a state to warmonger, state to be terrorist, right? So we are together in that form, and it's different layers though, but everybody is contributing to that. So that is very important. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Shreen. Now, Rehana, in 1 minute time. You're muted. Can you unmute, please?
I think the fourth phase or the fourth wave of women's movement, it is already connecting to the women at grassroots level. We have Aurat Azadi marches we had, in major, not only in major cities, but in the towns of Sindh, in far-flung areas like Multan, and there was Aurat March. So there is a difference of Aurat March and Aurat Azadi March. There is a difference of agenda points as well. But I think it is already happening. What is needed is that the women in leadership role nowadays, they have to make spaces for the women struggling at the grassroots and connect to them for larger women's rights agenda and interests of the women's rights movement. But I think it will take some time in Pakistani context. It's my, thank you.
Okay. Thank you, Rehana and all the panel speakers and commentator, for a very valuable insight. I think it's been quite, enriching, discussion, and we will definitely continue this, discussion even in the future. And I think I really, learned a lot from this, discussion. And I think one of the thing that we can take away from this discussion is like how to make the women-led movement like more inclusive. I think that's something very important, and also how to strengthen like different movements that are taking place within the country and even across the region, so that so that could build a kind of solidarity among those movements. I think that's also very, very important. And I also, would like to emphasize that how to, I think women should not just be limited to the women-related issues, the movement that are related to, let's say, women issues. But I think how we could actually also bring women into the mainstream social movement, mainstream political movement. I think that would also be, a very important way to strengthen like women participation in social justice and nonviolent movement. I think we will continue, more discussion in the future. And once again, thank you, Shreen and Meena and Rehana, Punamji, for your very valuable insight. And thank you all the participants for your, active, listening, I should say. Sorry, we could not allocate a lot of time for question and answer. And with this note, I'd like to, end this webinar, and hope to see you again in the future. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, everyone. Stay safe.